The world's best physios don't just treat, they coach. Welcome to the Physio Coach Podcast. This episode is sponsored by Jane App. Jane is a practice management platform that helps clinicians like you and I spend less time on admin and more time caring for people. From online booking and scheduling to notes, reminders and billing, Jane is designed to reduce the day-to-day load on busy clinicians like us. After a few years of running Better Physio Group, we wanted to level up our practice management system. 10 minutes into the demo call and I was convinced. Use code Physio Coach 2MO, that's Physio Coach 2MO to get 2 months free. Sign up to the demo and see it for yourself. This podcast is a product of Better Physio Group, provider of physio and PT services in central London, helping people in pain, suffering with injury to feel better and live better. There's physio and then there's better physio. So every day coming into clinic, into the podcast studio, I'm on my Brompton, cycling my way in, down the embankment, lovely view. I've usually got six gears to choose from. Today I had one, my bike was broken, so I'm spinning in the wrong gear. My legs are spinning fast trying to get in. And it just made me think. I had our guest today, William Wayland, sports performance consultant, building the world's best golfers. And I had one of his old podcasts that he was a guest on last year in my ears and was talking about something we'll come to. And it just made me think of my experience this morning, spinning my gears with no options, no extra gear to shift to, how that mirrors sometimes what we do as physios and what we don't do as physios. We don't offer people an extra gear. They don't have the option to go up a level in their performance, in their life, because we underload, in my opinion. I think we severely underload as physios. So we're welcoming on William today to teach us how do we avoid that problem? How do we avoid spinning our gears down the embankment with no options? How do we make sure we've got enough gears to shift into, William? So welcome onto the show today. Thanks for coming on. We briefly met many years ago, and I was quite impressed with some stuff that you were speaking to other physios about. So I knew you'd be a good person to come on and teach us physios how to be better coaches, because that's ultimately what the show's about. And if the watchers are looking at William, they would be quite confused when I said building the world's best golfers, because William doesn't look like a golfer himself, and he is absolutely not a golfer necessarily. I'm sure he can swing a club, but he knows how to build the world's best golfers. So we're going to spend some time today discussing how that came about, where that passion came from, the roots of that, and how us physios can learn a little bit from William. So I'll bring you in now. If you could tell us a little bit about what you take from me and my metaphor there about me spinning the wheels of my Brompton and having no options to shift up. What do you take from that?
Sure. And just for the record, I swing a golf club really badly. I'm not a golfer at all. That's not my sport. And in the golf world, I have been challenged like, well, what do you know about golf? You don't play. But at the same time, I don't ride superbikes or fight in the UFC, but I've worked with both athletes, so domain expertise being what it is. But in terms of that metaphor, you're right. I have the luxury of being in a position where I work with lots of physios, and there's that distinct, siloed effect of physios do this, strength and conditioning coaches do this, and then what we need to think about is, well, where does the overlap actually exist between the two disciplines? And there is some overlap, and some physios do grab at strength and conditioning and go, well, here's an adjunct practice I can bring in, but a lot focus purely on the very medical aspects of what it is they do. And there's kind of a disconnect between treating a person like a patient and then treating them like a performer and bridging that gap. I don't know if you're familiar, but there is a sub-discipline that has kind of popped up called a reconditioning coach. Mm-hmm. And they're increasingly starting to appear in places because they bridge that gap. And a good physio should kind of have a handle on, well, how do we go from patient management into getting them back to performance? Because everyone pays lip service to RTP, right? Everyone wants to talk about return to play. I said, well, what does that actually mean? How do we go from, our timeline's finished, you've had your 12 weeks rehab, check your box, off you go, see you later. And it's like, well, there's been no intensification to get them back to performance standard in terms of like loading, things like that. It's kind of almost like, that time frame has been completed, the box is checked, off you go, back to your sport. That often doesn't end well, as I'm sure you're aware, and it's that thinking about, well, where can we intensify? Golf puts me in a unique position where I've seen a lot of programs, physios write for athletes, because a lot of the time golfers get training programs from physios because golf is heavily medicalized. A lot of the initial strength and conditioning interventions that were brought to golf fitness, were designed by people with this rehabilitation background. And that rehabilitation background then informs the way you do your performance practice. No fault of the practitioner. It's just that foundation, that level of understanding informs how they then practice. So I was getting PDFs of programs, sometimes those nice printouts with pictures, always a classic. And everything's 3x10. Everything's 3x12 for everything, for like 6 to maybe 12, 16 exercises. And I'm looking at this and going, well, where's the intensification? Where's the preparedness for sport? And where's the actual, understanding of overload in terms of building the athlete? And that's where obviously this sort of rehabby approach falls down, because the idea is it's supposed to get people, off the bed, moving again, but then it doesn't make that joined up jump to how do we get them performing for sport. And this is where I think physios are obviously better served by taking some time to understand S&C, taking some time to understand the depth of strength training, the craft of actually moving, lifting in the gym, getting some chalk on your hands, lifting a barbell, this type of stuff. Don't get me wrong, some physios do this and they're good at it, but a lot of them don't put the time into barcraft, which is what I call it, is the time of learning how to intensify a training program. What does it feel like to lift close to your 1 RM? What does training at that type of intensity feel like? When I perform movements, what am I feeling for? What am I looking for? Where's the nuance? Where's the craft in the way I lift and what I do? And if you have a good understanding of that, it makes you unafraid to then start going, well, we can apply intensity. We can start making things harder. Things like that. Does that make sense?
There's been this big swing in the pendulum of technique not mattering, right? And what you're describing there is that technique absolutely matters.
Oh, yeah.
And I've always struggled a little bit with the move away from technique being important, because I know that it does and it doesn't. I know that there's certain things that there is a margin of safety. I know that's true. But I also know that when it comes to efficient, effective activation of the body in ways that are performance-oriented, in ways that are optimal for their body, I know that it does matter, because I know you make some small shifts. They feel very different for the person. They lift better. They move better. The quality just enhances. So I've always been stuck in the middle thinking, hang on a minute, what am I missing here? Why are all these people that I respect and trust in the physio community telling me that technique doesn't matter? And here you are sitting in front of me telling me that the craft absolutely matters, that does matter. So tell me what your stance is on here. How do we swing this pendulum back to somewhere meaningful and something that resonates with people like me in the middle?
I have I really enjoy aesthetics, and I think it might not to get too high-minded, a Nietzsche quote, which was like, morals have an aesthetic sensibility. You're always happy to kill a cockroach, but never happy to kill a butterfly, right? And I think lifting and movement have an aesthetic component too. And I think if you deny that, you're denying something sort of very fundamental just to human behavior, human movement. Like, human beings are very good at picking up ugly movement. It's something we've naturally evolved to do. And you look at someone with a normal gait, for instance, and you can spot it from 100 meters away, because it's called the behavioral immune system, but we're very good at picking up when people are potentially in a diseased state. So we know when someone's moving and potentially something is wrong. When someone's limping, right? You can spot that. The same way when someone lifts something up, and someone lifts something up with a very rounded spine, what's your reaction?
Yeah, you can see it. You're like, I would just a little bit like, okay, I need to do something to that.
Yeah,
actually. Well, and then I have the bit in my back. So like, actually, you can lift with a flex spine, and I agree with that too. I agree that that both of those facts can be true.
Yeah.
And yet I can still, when they're under a heavy load, I can still think, I still feel like I need to help them learn how to hinge better there.
Yeah. When someone lifts like a question mark, that visceral sucking of the teeth, is the reaction most people have, because they know that inherently something's off with that movement. It's not good movement. And again, there's wiggle room. like the people, and this is where I also think using like idiosyncratic examples of people who can still perform amazing strength feats with otherwise slightly, let's call it sort of, a corruption of their form.
Well, let's go to the world record deadlift, right?
Yeah,
most people have probably seen a video of the world record deadlifts, and there's multiple videos of similar 1 RM massive record where they have a flexed spine, right?
Yeah.
So how do we make sense of that compared to what you're saying here?
Yeah. So, for instance, when someone is lifting heavy like that, and they're very extreme of their movement capacity, aberration is going to happen. You can't stop that. When you do a 500 kilo deadlift, your T-spine is going to be flexed because most T-spines cannot handle that type of load in a sort of otherwise neutral position. Don't get me wrong. If things further down the chain start coming apart, then you're going to have serious problems because the structures of the lumbar, other parts of the body, they'll have a physical capacity to be able to tolerate a certain amount of deformation. That's why injuries occur, right? And that's why having efficient movement that sort of leans on the structures properly is always going to be good, because if you spend a lot of time lifting with technique that let's say it's aesthetic, it looks good, it looks right, when those aberrations do occur, you're going to have a tolerance for dealing with those awkward or ugly situations, right? I know, for instance, that if I'm doing a heavy front squat, as long as all my sub-max work is practiced with a very, very good technique, when it gets close to nearly 100%, maybe my T-spine will flex a little bit. My elbows might drop a touch, but I can tolerate that. It's when you set people up from the get-go, lifting with form that it's otherwise questionable, I think in the long run, you're setting them up for problems, because aberration will lead to further aberration, if you understand what I'm saying. So bad technique is just going to lead to worse technique later on. Whereas if you drill fundamentals, get people moving in a fashion that looks, aesthetically pleasing. And this is the thing, this is where the coaching eye matters, is the aesthetic of the movement is important. And again, people are good at sensing good movement. And partly what's happened is we've reached this real sort of relativistic point of like, it's fine. People can move however they want. It's fine. And you then see these videos of people, and it causes a riot online, right? Of someone posting an athlete or a well-known athlete lifting with bad form, and the comment section is stuffed with people, of all sorts of opinions. And, sometimes these elite performers can get away with that stuff. Your average patient, your average client isn't an elite performer. That's why I always suggest I drill them, get them to really pick up a sensibility of what good technique is, whatever it might be, your basic movement patterns. And this is where, when we teach juniors, I establish all those basic movement patterns first. That's the key. Get them started, and then I know that once they're very, very competent, I have to worry about them far less,
There's Djokovic comes to mind here, like when you see him flying around a tennis court and his body is in all sorts of weird and wonderful positions in order to get the ball. He's maxing out, right? That's the aberration that you're talking about. Yeah. He's doing whatever he needs to do in order to achieve the goal, which is to win the point. And my suspicion is that when he's training, he's not doing that. He's training in a way that's refining technique in a really precise way. And then when he's maxing out, he's earned the right to do that. And I'd imagine what you're getting at here is the same in the gym. You earn the right with all your sub-max training to every now and again max out and do something weird and wonderful. And that aberration comes in, and your body can handle it because it's got the resilience in all the right places. Yeah,
you have to engage in fundamentals before you can engage in abstraction. You think about like the best painters, right? It's particularly a lot of the early modern painters, modern artists. A lot of them were classicists. You look at some of the early pencil drawings some of these guys did, you would call them, I think Pablo Picasso is a good example of some of his early drawings. They're what you consider sort of classic sort of art. Then later on, he engaged in abstraction. And I think with sports movement, it's the same thing. You draw your fundamentals first, and then once you have a solid understanding, then you can engage in abstraction. And if we, let's call it a Pareto distribution, right? So that fundamentals, that establishment of the base, that's 80% of the work you do. Then that final 20% is the ability to explore movement, engage in abstraction. Golf performance is a good example because they kind of got this backwards. And a lot of golf fitness when they first started out was all in service of let's call sport specificity. So they were desperately trying to serve this notion of sport specificity in the gym, doing golfy movements. You've seen it, right? The cable swings and all this stuff. And what they weren't doing was addressing the fundamentals of good strength and conditioning, which is mastering the basic movement patterns. This is why golf has suddenly seen this upsurge in distance and in size of the athletes and in power, because they've finally got it right. They've got it the right way around. Don't get me wrong, there were some early guys early on who did, Gary Player, good example, a few guys who did it well early on, but a lot of the crowd didn't, because there was this very medicalized practice of golf. So it has to be golf specific, it has to serve the needs of the sport. Well, actually, we serve the needs of the sport if we engage in good fundamental strength and conditioning. So by engaging in what we're doing now with a lot of golfers, which is, what would be considered really orthodox strength training, lift weights, jump, throw. 80% of the work we do. That final 20% is the polish, right? Is that last little bit. But for the longest time, golf had it the wrong way around. Only now we're seeing the greatest distances. Totally different type of golfer coming through at the moment because of that foundation of strength and conditioning that's appearing in college golf, that's appearing in, our long-term athletic development plans, the work we're doing at England Golf. That's all making a difference in terms of these players that are coming through, these kids now that are striping the ball because they're just athletes, and that makes a big difference.
If we wind back just to the aberrations of movement here,
sure,
and then I'm definitely going to explore the golf. But I feel like we need to finish the part here of the inclusion of loaded flexion in something along the lines of a Jefferson curl.
Yep.
To me, seems like a fundamental principle as well of exposing the spine to what it needs to do and being strong and robust there. But there is a difference in the load that you will be putting through those movement patterns from my perspective. So what I wouldn't want the listener to be thinking of is, that's it, right? Let's throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's all about, absolutely nailing the hip hinge and the squat patterns. Like, to me, there's still a role for those loaded flexion exercises as well. How do you integrate that into fundamental movement patterns, into that 80-20 rule, getting the 80% right?
Yeah. So it would act as an adjunct. So my argument would be, can you hinge well before you do a Jefferson curl? I wouldn't come at it the other way around.
Yeah.
You wouldn't teach people to Jefferson curl and then to hinge right? Not from a movement, not from a. I would do it from an injury rehab perspective, based on what I see in front of me. But I agree with you. I've worked with athletes before, and I would refine the hip hinge first, and then you say, oh, by the way, we also need to make sure that you can handle some loaded flexion as well. Because my question for you is, what do people do when they don't know how to hinge?
They
Jefferson curl. So they do that first, and obviously there's a limit. And I'm always going to say that people who can hinge well will probably Jefferson curl better later than if you were to just let them flex their spine every time and then try and teach them the hinge.
Correct. I spend a lot of time teaching people how to hip hinge, and I find that takes a long time to coach. And I don't struggle teaching people how to Jefferson curl once they free up their mind and realize it's not dangerous. And then they go, oh, wow, this feels great. And then it's nice to stretch my spine and all that. So I agree. Yeah, I think the hinge is the more complex skill to teach if it hasn't been done early.
Yeah.
So then how does a man of your stature end up coaching the world's best golfers? How did that come about? Tell us the long version of that.
So the irony is it was Physios that helped me get that job, because I was working with combat athletes for a long time, and you want a population of athletes that's constantly injured. Combat sports is your one. Like, those guys are hurt all the time because of soft tissue issues. It's contact sport, particularly if they do jiu-jitsu. The aim of jiu-jitsu is joint destruction, right? So they're always going to be seeing physios. So it was a case of working with a number of combat athletes, some of whom were then in contact with the physio, a guy called Dan Coughlin.
Hello, Dan. I studied with him.
Oh, brilliant.
Yeah.
And it was Dan who then said, look, I really like what you're doing in strength and conditioning space. We need someone like you involved in golf, because I feel that you're very pragmatic. You're going to bring something different because of your approach. This is, again, this key emphasis on being very, very good at fundamentals. I feel that's what golf needs, because, again, golf is very focused on this hyper-specific model. We need someone to come in and basically say, no, we need to do fundamentals, writ large. And he basically gave me a chance. A lot of these, they're based on opportunities. He gave me the opportunity to do some work on the challenge tour. I went out, did some work. The response from the players was good, and it kind of grew from there. Did one event, did a couple of events, and my role, consulting for the tour, sort of grew, and the response from the players was always very good. We saw some good outcomes, and then from there it just grew. Started doing work on the DP World Tour as well. And then started working with England Golf, and it just kind of grew and grew and grew. Just again, because I was popping up in golf. I guess I don't look like a golfer, so it's like, well, immediately that garners interest, right? People, who the hell is this guy? Is he worth the chat with? And in that instance, I think it was a case of, well, and then people look online, they're like, well, look what this guy's doing. Again, it's a weird marketing trick of people, well, this guy doesn't look like a golfer, what's he doing on the driving range, and then players are interested, right? They'll talk to me and we'll get into a conversation. And the other thing was just bringing in, that strength and conditioning ethos, bringing in orthodox strength and conditioning testing, which was a big change, because I'm sure you're familiar, golf is for a long time like very reliant on TPI screen, things like this, subjective screens that are golf specific. I came in and went, well, let's test with force platforms. Let's use the fundamental S&C building blocks here. Let's do IMTP. Let's do counter movement jump testing. Let's do this stuff, and then see how that tracks to golf qualities like club head speed, things like that, and build that relationship between those things.
How does it track?
So most of the time, if you've got a good IMTP, if you've got a good mid-thigh pull, and you have a good counter movement jump, typically your club head speed is going to be high. Because the one thing, I guess, that the big change was everybody in golf was very focused on mobility, right? Rotation through T-spine, rotation through upper body, big fact. Everyone's like, it's all about...
I still hear it.
Yeah.
I still hear it on commentary.
Turns out it's ground reaction force that's actually the key, because you can't shoot a cannon from a canoe, right? So what we're seeing is lots of the best guys have really good ground reaction forces, because that enhancement of X factor stretch allows them to push into the ground really hard, generate a ton more club head speed. And we found that basically being more explosive in the low body, just that quality goes up. You've got good club head speed, you've got good ball speed, you're hitting it further. Players who hit it further are more likely to win more prize money. You can do the math, right? So it makes sense that these guys are the ones who are generally, these days, especially winning more golf tournaments, are the guys who are hitting it further. Yeah,
well, it sort of started around sort of Dustin Johnson, Brooks Koepka, and then DeChambeau comes along, and he's what was it? One season he just gained about 5-10 kilos of muscle mass, right?
Yeah,
and now it's pretty standard, right? That it's a huge part of the elite level.
Yeah, because the athletic golfer is definitely something that's here to stay.
Yeah,
golf purists don't like it.
Yeah,
because they argue that courses have to be made longer. They blame the equipment, they blame this, they blame that. But the key thing is, you got to remember that in most sports, participation at the amateur being anywhere near to the professional, it's a big gap. In golf, it was always seen differently. There's always seemed like the two things were pretty close. That if you were good enough, you could qualify for the Open, go play, and maybe potentially win.
There was that story, right? Guy, there was that amateur who came in and sort of hustled his way in, and he was a bit of a mess, but he was basically an average Joe who got away with it for like a whole round. I think it was. I can't remember. I actually watched the film of it the other day.
So it can happen.
Yeah.
Because golf is still don't get me wrong, golf still is a very skill dependent sport.
Yeah.
But anytime high-level athleticism starts to appear, you see this gap begin to emerge, right? Because suddenly it's not just enough that you're highly skilled. You build that high level of skill on a base of athleticism. Suddenly they're in a whole different space, right? And they want to roll back the ball and make lots of other changes, potentially coming in to keep the game a little bit shorter. The guys who hit it far are still going to hit it far. I don't see how that's going to make any meaningful difference. But going back to my point is that we figured out that high levels of ground reaction force make a big difference. But the other thing is this: golf is tough on the body. People don't respect that. And by being physically stronger, by being more physically robust, you can survive playing 30 plus weeks on tour a year. Because golfers, I guess golf and injury is something that are considered almost like synonymous, right? The two things pretty much, back injury, golf, the two things almost go together. What we're seeing is, well, if you want to play high level professional golf or just golf in general, You can consider like hitting a drive. That's 5,000-6,000 newtons force through spine on contact with the ball. You need to be robust enough to tolerate that, because I don't know your day-to-day work, how many golfers you see, but you're probably getting a lot of low back complaints, right?
Yeah.
Like if it's golf, and it's because the body just isn't prepared to tolerate those generation and absorption of those types of forces, and that's where being physically robust, actually doing a well-rounded gym program, can make a difference in that regard.
Well, yeah, lo and behold, my Sunday golfers do very well when I introduce them to a hip hinge and some hip thrust and a few basic fundamental movement patterns. Yeah. And when you first get to know these golfers, it sounds like they really engage with it. So there must be, pretty early on, they must be thinking, hang on a minute, there's something to this. So how did that play out in the early days? Because now it's pretty obvious they don't really need to be sold. It doesn't need to be pitched. They understand it. But in the early days, what was that introduction like as you start to chat to these? They must kind of go, hang on a minute, you look different.
Yeah.
What is there that you could teach me about golf?
There was a wariness, I'll be honest. And some of the players were a little bit afraid. There's a cautiousness because sometimes they've had poor experiences in the past. The amount of times I've had guys even at a high level tell me, I used to lift, but I don't anymore because deadlift hurt my back, for instance. Like they'll have quite often these anecdotal stories of I did X, Y, and Z, and strength and conditioning is not for me. And in the early days, I heard a lot of that. I guess it's because I was dealing with a slightly older generation of golfer as well. And a lot of the time they come in again with this general wariness. But then there were some, I guess, who were like that. They want any edge they can find. And it's the inquisitive ones I found that were like, well, I want to hit it past everybody else. I'm going to take whatever, I can get out of them. The ETPI, it's free to the players. So it's like, well, there's a free service here. I'm going to get in touch with this guy and we can do some, objective performance testing. And he can tell me, well, physically, here's what I need to do. We can potentially give them a roadmap, because one of the problems in golf, unlike other sports, and this is something Dan Coughlin's talked about, is that golfers often are their own performance manager. So they're grabbing at different branches. They don't really have a clear path. Unlike other sports where a coach is like, right, this is the plan. We're doing this, we're doing this, we're doing this. In golf, they don't have that. The golf coach teaches the golf swing, teaches them golf tactics, but doesn't help with their weekly management, doesn't help with their year-long plan. Some do, but a lot don't. Often it's down to the player to make all these decisions. And from a physical training standpoint, again, they've got to source this themselves. And I guess it's where coming as, well, hey, look, here's someone who can help me plan this stuff. And this is where I guess I went from being an S&C coach more into performance sort of management for some of these guys, helping with their day-to-day lives, helping with their recovery routines, telling them how long to go into the sauna for, if they should ice bath or not today, that type of stuff. And just helping them organize their lives a little bit, which is what they didn't have before, because when you're an athlete out on a sport playing, quite often quite lonely, with no real direction or sort of focus on, well, what should I do on what days? I've got a week off. What should I do this week? A lot of the times they're left to their own devices. But having that person there to help kind of push you, and this is the other thing, when you make that connection with a player, you emphasize that you're there really to in their best interest. You're there to help them, whereas it's odd because they'd approach you, especially when I first started, they're a little bit suspicious.
Yeah, I bet.
Which feels weird because it's like, look, I'm here to help you out, mate. And they're like, what do you think I'm going to make you do? Like push-ups until you throw up? They have this very strange relationship with what strength and conditioning represents. Maybe they went to a college in the US that had a poor program where they just did whatever the football team did, and they were doing circuits and stuff, and it was awful, And then, or in an instance where they were maybe had a program from their physio after they got hurt, they were doing 3 sets of 10 on everything and got bored after 12 weeks. And this is kind of where golf was kind of hamstrung for a little while, was a lot of the time players would only seek out strength and conditioning post-injury. So they were getting hurt. Suddenly the realization is, wait a minute, I do need to be more robust. Well, my only point of contact thus far is my physio. Maybe he can write me a strength and conditioning program. And the physio, being a rehab expert, does what he does best and writes a rehab program.
Yeah.
And no fault of the practitioner. It's what they know, right? So everything will be 3 sets of 12, lots of bands, lots of cable work, but that lack of intensification perhaps that's needed to improve qualities like ground force, because at the end of the day, physio has a lot of domain expertise, but in particular, like high levels of force production, ground reaction forces, stuff like that, might be a little bit outside of their wheelhouse, right? But again, they're going to prescribe 3 sets of 12 on lunges or something, because I guess that covers that base. At least that's what they're hoping it does. Or they might not prescribe jumps, for instance. Like jumping and golf is a weird one. A lot of golfers are like, why am I jumping? And it's like, well, there's a good reason for this. We can see improved jump, force, particularly jump impulse, leads to improved club head speeds. And again, it's having that, understanding that connection. Because again, some of my work is teaching golfers how to jump again, because a lot of them haven't jumped for years, not since like a PE class or something. So they're teaching them to do basic jumps, box jumps, just vertical jump, bodyweight jump, that type of stuff, because they've not done it for a long time, if that makes sense.
But what you're getting at there is that it started from this awareness raising concept of let's test this, let's measure something, and we know that this correlates with this. Your performance outcome is here in this number, and your current capacity is here. So there's a big gap. So we need to fill that gap, right? And that's where the parallel runs with what we do in clinic, or certainly the modern physio is doing, is that we are using testing, we're using objective measurements. Force plates are everywhere these days, and even if they're not, you can use a phone app, you can use all sorts of different techniques where you can highlight the gap. And you were talking about this reconditioning phase, is that the modern physio is starting to figure out how to bridge that gap. I certainly feel like that's my role now, is I bridge the gap between the injury and returning to performance. I don't do the performance. As soon as it gets to performance, like, no, you need to go and work with a coach, strength and conditioning coach. But I do bridge the gap these days because I use testing and I understand the difference between 3 sets of 10 and 2 sets of 5, or whatever I'm trying to create. I'm trying to increase ground reaction force or whatever other metric. I'm trying to work them towards some level of power output, not just some level of, mid-range strength quality and some hypertrophy. But the testing is the bit that guides that. And I often know what this person will need, but the testing is the bit that the person sees and goes, oh, I understand that now, because I thought I was fine, but actually this testing is showing that I'm not. Which is weird how there are these parallels between an elite athlete and an everyday Joe who comes in, because often there isn't. They are very different. And we spoke about this in the prep call, how we sometimes try and draw parallels, but we can't, because an elite athlete is an elite athlete for a reason. But in this context, actually what you're saying is there was such a disparity between what they should be doing and what they were doing, that it was a very easy conversation to have with a data-led approach. And that's what the physio, I think, takes from that, is that if you just understand the demands of what they're trying to do and what that requires, and you have some level of testing that you're good at, so you just need to be relatively sufficient at going through this testing protocol to know that it's reliable, then you've got a really powerful behavior change motivator. You've got some numbers in front of you that speak to the person, so they could go, oh, I understand it now. I understand why I need to commit to this for longer than 2 or 3 months. I understand why I need to go through beyond my pain, right? It's not just that we're trying to get rid of pain, it's that we're trying to make sure this doesn't happen again. And what you then had the opportunity to do is to say, how about we do this before you have an injury? I end up seeing people that are injured and have pain. But what I'm trying to do to them on the other side of it is, let's make sure we solve the reason why you had injury in the first place. And by the way, along the way, you might hit your drive a bit further, because I do speak to golfers a fair amount and say, one of the side effects of this approach is that you hit the ball further, you hit the ball with more efficiency, and that might be fun, mightn't it? And they go, oh, hang on a minute, I'm interested in this. Similar conversation with runners. Yeah, injury prevention is cool, but you might also run a bit faster, and then you get their attention, right? So for you, that's what you needed to be able to prove, and the data started to speak to them in a different way. What other data did you start to learn impacted the golfer? Because ground reaction force is clearly one. Counter movement jump, mid-thigh pull. What else did you start to use?
There were, low-hanging fruit, like movement, for instance. So, biggest things in terms of, like, if you were looking at things from a very structural standpoint, how many degrees of separation can we get between trunk and hips? And for most pros, it's like, sort of at 70, sometimes even higher, up to 90 degrees. And the other thing is then, what does movement of the hips look like? Can they internally rotate the hips? Most people can externally rotate pretty well, most golfers do it pretty well. But in terms of internal rotation, obviously if you've got a limitation in your internal rotation, there's going to be a problem. And we do sort of, sitting test, 45-degree internal rotation, that type of thing. So those are two basic screens that are really easy to run for most people. We might do some basic table tests with them, that type of stuff. From terms of a movement standpoint, most of the time when you're in front of a pro golfer, for instance, if you're worried about their movement, there's a disconnect, because when people run these screens, and I've seen people run full screens, like movement screens that are taken half an hour, 40 minutes on a pro golfer. We're talking someone, they wouldn't be at this level if they didn't move well. What are we trying to achieve here? Most of these time these guys are excellent movers. That stuff perhaps maybe should be thrown towards the amateur, lower level guys, or guys who are just trying to get into it. In terms of other metrics that we look at with golf, we started looking at things like, what other impacts do we see during the course of the week? So we started looking, because all of them wear whoop bands, so we started looking at the data that was throwing up simple interventions like, can we make a difference with sleep? This type of thing. How many hours of sleep they're getting a night, this type of stuff, because we have a pretty busy travel schedule, as I'm sure you're aware. So these guys are traveling a lot, things like circadian rhythm, stuff like that, all affected. We found that sleep quality has an enormous impact on golf performance. So things like that were making a difference. So we started getting into like holistic factors as well, just outside of like what was immediately important for these guys. But in terms of raw measures, we had to keep it as simple as possible, because historically they were kind of kitchen sinked in terms of these screens that they were given. So it was like, we actually know we have to bring this back. So for instance, with the ETPI, the four basic screens were, what's your club speed, what's your ball speed, what's your RMTP, what's your counter movement jump. And then we've added and taken away, we did some neck testing. We were doing neck testing for a while and trying to set norms for that, because neck injuries, they can happen in golf. And when they do, it can destroy a week, because you've maybe slept on a hotel bed, or your swing volume has gone up and suddenly you've got a neck that won't do what you want it to do. Things like that would happen. So we started testing a little bit of neck. We've looked at grip.
What did you find with neck?
So with neck, we started doing really simple testing, like lateral flexion. This movement with a harm. No, we used a Muscle Lab load cell, literally with a head harness and a handle.
Yeah.
Basic, DIY stuff. And we were testing them, and we were looking at the sort of kilos forces in the neck that they were generating, and we're looking at sort of 40 to 45 kilos, some up to 50, and then we were sort of trying to figure out, again, it's kind of experimental on our part. We were trying to figure out, well, where do the norms sit for these guys? And we were finding that obviously, if we're looking at neck interventions, we're hopefully decreasing, risk of re-injury of neck, but we're still working on that. That's another thing we're working on.
But that 45, you're saying 45 kilos on a lateral flexion, that's high numbers, right? I do this testing with people. I've been in rugby long enough to have played around with this. And like 45 kilos is big. So elite athlete, right? It's like they're doing this stuff to a high level already. So when you're seeing anything below that, then you're starting to get a bit nervous about it, thinking, right, we need to...
Potentially, but that's where... Because we're dealing with like a small sample size, stuff like that, we're still trying to figure out. But this is where, the everyday practice kind of lead to the sports science, right? Because we as practitioners have to try out this stuff, experiment with novel testing, just to see if we've can grab onto a thread of something, to see where it goes.
It's funny because you said about like you were kitchen sinking it, right? And I use this metaphor all the time. Like for the person who comes into me, they're paying me to get them better, so I'm going to kitchen sink them. Every now and again, I'll like scientific approach. Let's do one variable at a time just to make sure we're clear here. But I need to make sure I get an outcome with this person quick, and I'll kitchen sink them, and I'll explain it, and I'll discuss that. But what you're saying there is that maybe you'll sometimes kind of throw something new in and check that it actually matters, and then you'll pull it back out again if it doesn't. Then you'll throw something else and then pull it back. That's a sort of a mini kitchen sink, right?
Well, it's the adage of absorb what is useful, reject what isn't, right? Like and strength and conditioning, I guess sports science in general, operates on that fundamental premise, which is why if you go to the core of what good strength and conditioning is, it's not changed in a very long time.
Yeah.
fundamentals don't really change an awful lot.
Even across sports, right?
Even across sports.
The more I look at it, the more I hear and speak to people like yourself, the more I realise that there's so much carryover across the board, which is why we talk about athletic development, not necessarily sport-specific development anymore. And because I've worked in a few sports, you start to realise, oh wait, they're literally training the same stuff. They're just using different language for different sports. They might package it up and there's a few little adjuncts here and there, but the main core principles are the same. Can I take you back to hip internal rotation?
Sure.
There might be a little rabbit hole tangent that we go off on here, because you mentioned about that, and I was picturing in my head about the relevance of that, thinking, backswing, right-handed player, left side internal rotation, then it goes through to follow through right hip internal rotation. Mm-hmm. Okay, I get that. If they are limited there, what are you doing with that?
The first thing that happens, if they are limited, what we see is basically compensations start to creep in, right? Generally, they start shifting their hips.
Yeah.
And first off, we have to make sure that that's not causing any problems, because quite often that will show up like low back pretty quickly if that's an issue. In terms of what we do, we can mobilize. It's a pretty simple strategy. We can see what their warm-up routines look like, what their mobility strategy looks like. The other thing is we've got to make sure that their anatomy is not just built that way. They just, for whatever reason, cannot internally rotate, and then we'll figure out strategies. Do they maybe turn the toe out or something, or things like that to help them move around it. Sometimes coach will pick that up and be like, we do this particular movement strategy because they can't internally rotate. Hopefully, there's not a structural issue. If there isn't, generally we can then start toying with like mobilizations, maybe then look to start doing loaded work very carefully, often standard loaded work where they're shifting the hip over the leg. That will take place as sort of, all sorts of drills potentially for doing that. There are a few neat toys that golfers do have, like the platforms that rotate and stuff, where you can get people actively, because this is the other thing. If you're doing mobility like in a internal rotation in a quadruped position, or laying on your back and you're doing hip IR, it's not the same as doing it standing. So that's where maybe you do start getting into some of the funky sort of standing hip IR drills that you can do with people, often reaching with a band or a cable where they fix one leg and rotate over hip, stuff like that, just getting them moving through hip, for instance. Again, because I've seen people smash out lots of mobs and stuff on the floor, and then they stand up and they're like, I still don't have the movement. I was like, well, it's because we need to address it in a specific fashion. That's when we do approach that few % of difference we can make by perhaps doing something in a very specific way, and that drill will look different often depending on the equipment we have available. So for instance, when we're traveling, we might only have bands, we might have cables, we might have, the player will have to adapt the drill based on what they need. But what we find is something like simple like hip IR, if they hammer it for a couple of weeks, particularly if it's a mobility issue, it gets better really, really quick.
Yeah. And if it's not getting better and it starts to flare things up, I guess that's a different situation.
That's a big problem, and that's where I hand them off to the physios to figure out quite often.
And the reason I've brought this up is because it's another bloody pendulum swing, right? Because there was this sort of, at one point everyone was smashing into hip internal rotation, thinking that if we just push hard enough, we'll stretch the capsule, we'll create more range of movement, and they'll be able to lift better, move better, and whatever else. And then a lot of people start to get hurt, and they start to realise that there is a finite capacity for the hip to internally rotate. Certainly if they've got some kind of cam or pincer impingement, or that's just the way they are, they're just limited in that fashion. And then now all of a sudden it's like nobody mobilises, or terrified of aggravating it. But sometimes just getting a little bit of mobility for the right person really works well, and they feel better, which is ultimately the key. They feel better when they move because they've done a bit of preparation work. But ultimately, it's all about how do they feel? Is it working or is it not? And then, quite rightly, you're saying that as soon as you're sensing a bit of a stirring up of some kind of possible hip joint problem, then refer out to the physio, and then we get to work. So another lovely pendulum swing here, and the term you used earlier was relativism.
Yes,
it's all relative, right? That's what you're getting at, and it almost feels like a get out clause for the sitting on their pedestal physio sometimes on Instagram, social media, whatever. How do we just put our flag in the ground here and go, okay, I'm just gonna claim this concept here? How? Because that's what I sense you're doing, quite bravely, confidently saying, this is just what I do, right? This is, you might have that stance, but this is what I do. It goes against the kind of, oh yeah, it's okay. We can do a bit of everything here and everything's safe. You can just do what you want. That's what you're getting at, right?
Well, I guess I'm advocating for what I call a third way. Let's put it that way, because I find that practitioners quite often fall into one of two camps, and it depends on the environment you've worked in. They're either hardcore structuralists, or they're phenomenologists or relativists. And these hardcore structuralists are the guys who are, it has to be about the science. It has to be about, everything has to be peer review. The evidence-based practitioners. And I'm sure you've come across plenty of these guys. If you work in elite sport, particularly like, let's say EPL or something like that, sports science departments are stuffed with these guys. Everything has to be data-led. Everything has to be data-driven, data. And it's like the cause and reason for everything they do. If the data's good, they're happy, right? Doesn't necessarily mean things are going well. And we see that sometimes. Whereas on the other hand, you've got the phenomenologists, the relativists, and this is, about the way the player feels. And this can be to do with like sense, feeling. It cannot be objective sometimes, and it's highly subjective. What's the athlete's lived experience? What's their, what are the vibes? This type of attitude. And basically what we're looking for is a smart merger of the two things, because the data guys can be misled. They can go down rabbit holes, because even though they're like, we're hyper objective, we're doing everything, based on scientific principles, that can get waylaid as well. They can follow bad data. We've seen, for instance, in sports science, there's a replication crisis, right? That's causing problems. Well, you have to take the data. You also have to take the subjective lived experience and try and merge those two things together as smartly as possible. There are good examples of people chasing particular types of data collection, but it turns out when it comes to real world application, data doesn't actually matter that much.
There's limitations to the data collection, right? You can only collect in certain ways. You can only do interventions in these kind of single variable ways, which is just not the way that performance maps out. It's not the way that the world maps out. The world maps out with multiple extraneous variables, or quote unquote extraneous variables, but they're all relevant. These variables all matter. So when you put them all together, that's when you suddenly get this kind of expertise of the practitioner that matters, because you've worked in a world where all these variables are at play, and you figure out that actually when you put all these things together, that makes a difference, not the one on its own, right? And we'll come on to the Nordic hamstring curl in a minute, because it seems relevant all of a sudden in my mind. But the reason I want to bring this up is because ultimately that evidence-based practice model requires the three variables to be considered appropriately. So sure, peer-reviewed research, that is one pillar, as is the patient and or the athlete's beliefs, expectations, and how they feel. But so is the expertise of the practitioner. So you put all those three things together, and in the middle you get the sweet spot, which is what you're saying. That's the third way, right? That's the third model. So in the end, this has been the way we should be doing things from decades ago.
Ideally, yeah.
But it hasn't been done.
No. And I'm of the opinion that in terms of being pragmatic, and it speaks to a broader cultural issue, I think, is that pragmatism and empiricism are kind of lost arts. Pragmatic, I guess, means going with what works, and then empirical means trusting perhaps what you are dealing with and the situation you're dealing with personally. And it's like a case of, well, I found this works. Does it work? Well, it works. And it's trusting our own intuition to some extent. And not being misled by that, because you can, again, chase false narratives that you perhaps built up yourself. People will chase particular exercises, particular modalities. We see this all the time with people who have something to sell. They're pushing a modality very hard because it fixes X, Y, and Z, cures cancer, whatever it may be. And then the other time you get the hardcore structuralists who just rubbish any outside idea because it's not peer reviewed. This hasn't been validated. So, well, if you're going to be that hard line about it, it means you're not going to embrace any new ideas until they've been peer reviewed, and you're going to be 10, 20 years behind what everybody else is doing.
I'm just going to take a very quick break. We'll be back soon. So in our practice, we see a mix of self-funders and we see some insurance cases as well. And it's really easy to differentiate between the two. There's a cute little icon just in the top part of the appointment bar that tells you what each case is for. And it's also really easy if you notice that there's someone's pack hasn't been added to their appointment, or if their insurance policy hasn't been added to their appointment. Super easy to just add it straight away into the case. So yeah, those little icons also show whether someone's booked online and on whether someone has paid or whether there's still outstanding payment. So yeah, really easy. Just a quick glance in the top right hand corner of the appointment, I can see what each case is, where they've come from, whether it's booked online. So yeah, I think it's just a really intuitive system to use. And now back to the episode. I've got this idea that I've stolen from one of my colleagues. I'm highly skeptical but eternally open-minded. Mm-hmm. And I think that combination allows me to be open-minded to a new idea, mm-hmm. but be very skeptical about it until I see that it's working in the real world. And I think that approach helps me to be pragmatic in the end, because that word really sits with me.
I can't remember who told me this, but it was basically, when it comes to new ideas, close the door but open a window, mm-hmm. because you can watch from the window. And I was like, oh, that kind of way. And this is kind of not to steal your segue, but that's kind of how I got to my ideas about Nordic hamstring curl. So yeah, it was a little bit of that. Yeah,
and that Nordic hamstring curl, I remember 10 years ago, about then, suddenly this new exercise pops up, right? It's like, wow, this Nordic hamstring curl seems to be addressing hamstring strain incidents, because they've got this hamstring strain crisis in Premier League football or like in international elite football. Mm. Let's do all this because the evidence is saying that we've got less injuries happening. But when they do, what's the protocol? 3 sets of 5 in off season, 2 sets of 3 in season, something like that. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's give everyone the Nordic hamstring curl. Brilliant, amazing. Let's see what happens. And then we're looking at it now 10 years down the line, and there's absolutely no change. If anything, people just sprint more and get more hamstring strains. So in football, that's what's happened. Yeah. So no change in incidents, but players are sprinting more because that's the demand of the game. Yeah. So then what do we do? Yeah. Over to you.
So, like yourself, when I first started in this industry, the Nordic wasn't really an exercise. I think I'd seen it in some old manuals, and there was like bodyweight hamstring raise. I think I saw it was called originally. People just did machine hamstring curls and a few other accessory exercises. A lot of people were doing Olympic lifts, hip hinges, that type of stuff. And then suddenly this wave appears in terms of like a mimetic fashion, right? Like this meme exercise of Nordics suddenly starts popping up. Oh, we've got the literature to back it up as well. I've also got a piece of equipment that can test the Nordic too, if you want to buy that off me. That appeared as well. And suddenly everyone's like, Nordics. We have objective data, pre-post testing. The numbers of Nordic for hamstring strength have gone up. Everyone's good. You guys can go play football, but the hamstring issues keep happening. And it's like, well, there's this strange situation that's occurred, and it's a couple of things, okay? People coaches, particularly if you're coaching teams, I don't know if you've ever trained a team before, but if you're training large teams, you'll generally head towards modalities that allow you to be efficient, right? Now, what do you think is tougher? Training a room full of guys how to do a proper Romanian deadlift, or getting in a room full of guys to do a Nordic?
The Nordic's going to be easier, yeah.
Because the Nordic's easier to coach. And if you're not keeping a beady eye on this, and I've learned this from coaching my kids, is if they're doing Nordic hamstring curls and you take your eye off them for a second, it becomes a controlled flop. Yep. Like they're not gutting it out like they should be, right? Just kind of going through the motions, doing it.
Because they know what it leads to. Because once they've done it a couple of times, they get crazy dogs and it's really sore for about a week.
Sore hamstrings. Now, the other thing is, and I've always been an advocate of the hip hinge, the Romanian deadlift. And the Nordic was looking to solve a problem that is, let's call it monoarticular, right? Your uniarticular, single joint, right? Single joint. You're trying to solve a multi-joint problem with a single joint exercise, right? And I guess this falls into the category of people who, again, what you've done is you've forgotten the phenomenology. You've made that fundamental mistake. You've narrowed in on one thing and gone, oh, if we increase the hamstring strength at the knee, that's going to fix all our hamstring problems. Now, what is sprinting? Is it a mono-articular joint issue, or is it a systemic problem?
It's systemic. It's multiple joints, right? It's complex movement that's happening across multiple joints, multiple muscles.
So if we're going to perform an intervention, am I going to perform the exercise intervention that is bi-articular, or in this case, very systemic? Have you ever done a very heavy Romanian deadlift before?
Yeah.
Where do you feel it?
Everywhere.
Right? So taking the option that is systemic, it's going to give you a lot of second order effects as well. It's not just hamstring happening. Grip, lats, spine,
cool,
everything. Okay, the movement in that case, or you can make a good movement case for that, is that the movement that gives you the most systemic gains is probably going to be the one that gives you the outcome you're looking for. Because looking at it from a loading perspective, when it comes to loading the Nordic, how many people do you see do it loaded ever?
No. Yeah, body weight. Yeah.
I've seen a handful of freaks do a loaded Nordic. Okay. How many people can then go from the eccentrics to the concentric?
Not many.
No.
It's hard.
When it comes to Romanian deadlift, I can scale it. It's a triphasic movement in that it has a eccentric, isometric, and concentric component that all those variables I can manipulate. I can't do that with the Nordic. So I've got a systemic, not that I'm selling Romanian deadlifts, I've got a systemic barbell movement that's going to have a ton of second order benefits. It's bi-articulate in that it's training glute, hamstring, both at the knee, both at the hip. Okay. And I can scale it and manipulate all phases of the movement, eccentric, isometric, and concentric. I can't get that from a Nordic, but because the Romanian deadlift is intensive from a coaching standpoint, a little bit more time needs to be invested to get people really good at it. And we're not talking, and this is the thing, you look at a lot of the research for Nordics, how long are the interventions?
8 weeks, 12 weeks.
Yeah. When it comes to coaching, say, a movement like a Romanian deadlift, what do you consider a fundamental movement pattern? That hip hinge?
Yeah.
Yeah. How long would you spend teaching someone that?
Before you could probably load it, yeah. Sometimes you're going to be spending a few weeks just coaching it, just teaching the movement pattern.
And you think about long-term athletic development, right? How long are we going to have someone hip hinging? Years.
Forever.
Yeah, forever. So in terms of, looking at things from that standpoint, I can see why hinge was kind of put to one side, because we've got this quick and easy intervention that looks really good on paper, right? Pre-post testing, I can take my numbers to the coach and say, look, this is the difference we've made. You say I've added 20, 30 kilos on my RDL, which looks good. One, does it give me a nice printout, right?
It's not just that. It's not as sexy on Instagram, right?
No.
It doesn't have that kind of appeal to the masses, because everyone's seen a deadlift for years. It's been a part of the gym for forever, so as long as people know, so they don't go, wow, that's cool. Yeah. So they just ignore it and just dismiss it. Yeah. But in the end, I fully buy into what you're saying. As you can tell, this is.
And let me be clear, but before people come after me, okay, I do use Nordics. Yeah. I do apply them. I believe that covering your bases is important. Seated hamstring curls. Again, once the darling of physios, right? Every physio's favorite exercise.
It's still mine. Still one of mine.
Still works, right? Still good movement. And again, it's a case of like, look, if depending on how much time I've got, if I have to boil, and it's always a good exercise I use with my mentees, if I have to reduce my training program to the minimum components, I usually challenge a set is like, right, you've got 30 minutes. We need to only do 3 exercises. What are you choosing? Do you think they ever program Nordic? No. Okay. It's usually some combination of squat, pull, hinge, right? Something like that. Mm-hmm. And it's because, again, based on who you're training, who's in front of you, provided people spend the time investing in a solid hinge pattern, that'll stay with you for the rest of your athletic career and hopefully your life, right? It's an exercise for longevity as well. I emphasize that. Whereas, you think about your older patients, your longevity patients, are you doing Nordics with them?
Nah.
Why not?
It's just not worth it. It's just not. Absolutely not. Hip hinge? 100%. Yeah, all of them will get it.
And it's a case of, again, circling back to, well, what are my fundamentals? What am I trying to service here? And it's just having people think perhaps a little bit deeper than, and again, it comes back, that objective, this is data-led, this is research-led. Again, perhaps sometimes our enthusiasm for something can lead us down a slightly abstract path, a little bit erroneous, perhaps chasing of a singular metric in our excitement, in vendors pushing equipment, in all of that, and we all get swept up in perhaps ignoring, something as simple as the craft of teaching a hip hinge really, really well.
Yes. And in the end, what you're saying is there's space for it all.
Yeah.
There's space for all of it. But if we're thinking of fundamental movement patterns and trying to get the minimally effective dose in maximally effective dose in a minimal time frame, hip hinge is going to win over a Nordic.
Yeah.
Which I agree with. I wonder if the same will happen over things like Copenhagen's and things like this as well. It's another kind of football sexy exercise that's still hanging around, and I also see huge value in it as an exercise, but not at the dispense of a lunge or a slight lateral lunge perhaps, or another hip hinge perhaps. So this might be a good time to introduce another favourite of the physio, which is the BOSU, the unstable training, the instability concept. Like, we need to make our patient, our athlete, more stable in order to help them with their injury, and they make that. This is the big leap. They make this big leap of, and therefore performance. Mm-hmm. It's like I've always had a real trouble with that. And just to be clear, I do occasionally use a BOSU for the right person. I think it's a great learning tool, and what tends to happen is they get really good at it really quick, and then they don't need it anymore. So I have had people come to me like, I've got this BOSU at home, can you help design a program that I can use around my BOSU so I can get good use of it? And that's what at the moment where I start to struggle, is like, you'll outgrow it real fast, and then you need to put it on eBay and get rid of it. So where does that fit within your understanding of athletic development?
Yeah. Don't get me wrong. I've had my exchanges with David Weck, so I know a lot about the BOSU ball, and it's ubiquitous in golf. For some reason, it appears all the time. So I'm having to put up with that item in particular appearing, and it has a place. And I've said this in the past, that basically something like a BOSU ball is a tool that then gets misapplied. So it has a context within which it works, but because instability is a neat interchangeable for intensity, it gets chucked in an awful lot. So, for instance, let's say I'm doing a single leg airplane sort of hip hinge type movement. That's hard enough doing just with body weight. But if I want to make that a lot harder, if I want to intensify that, I can get someone to do that on a BOSU ball, right? What I've done is I've convinced my client that they're working a lot harder by just changing the stability of the surface they're stood on.
And in some ways they are, which is why it's powerful, which is why that could be quite motivating for someone. Oh yeah, I can see this is really difficult, so I will get something out of it.
So it's that interchangeability of suddenly a task difficulty is shot up. So I've got this sense that things are harder. Now, what happens if I want to load that movement?
Yeah.
It becomes tricky, right? Because
you can, but not much.
No. So there's a ceiling is low, right? In terms of loading. And part of the reason for that is because if you're trying to produce very high levels of force, the system cannot be unstable, which is why I don't like the Bulgarian split squat an awful lot. What am I trying to do with the Bulgarian split squat?
You're almost hybriding, aren't you? You're trying to get the best of both worlds, create some instability, but also generate force production.
So what if I give you a hand support when you're doing Bulgarian split squat?
Increase stability, increase force production.
Yeah. So, and the question I have to ask is, well, what am I trying to do here? Most of the time, if we're doing strength and conditioning or even physio, I'm trying to improve force production, right? So if I can close the system a little bit, give a hand support, so hand supported Bulgarian split squats or hand supported split squats, or another movement I've championed, is that by adding a little bit of stability, I enhance force production enormously. And it comes to that question, well, what is it I'm trying to do? There's still a lot of systemic stress. It's not like doing a hack squat or a leg press or something with one leg, which obviously is highly stable. but I'm still getting a lot of set and order effects from doing the hand-supported split squat. And it's where do we sit on that spectrum in terms of something being highly unstable versus something being very closed and very, very stable, high levels of force production. And again, it's finding that middle ground that we keep coming back to is like, where's that sweet spot? So just go back to the BOSU wall. It appears in a lot of golf programs, an awful lot, because there's this inherent idea that somehow golf is because we're using the ground, we need to make what we're doing in terms of a relationship with the ground more challenging, which doesn't make sense. When you're swinging a golf club, what's the surface you stood on like?
Yeah, solid.
Solid. It's grass, might be a bit slippery, but it's not going to be as unstable as a BOSU ball is. So again, it's this misapplication of a tool that has a context and then applying it willy-nilly, for lack of a better term, just because it intensifies things, it makes things feel harder, but the use case starts to disappear, particularly if we're wanting to produce high levels of force. Coming back to what we were talking about, if I'm trying to improve ground reaction force, I'm not going to start doing things on a BOSU ball, am I? I need a stable surface in order to do that. And that's where I guess that starts to fall apart. And that's where the whole stability argument sort of doesn't make sense, because if you actually, and this is where I guess I started looking deeper, was I started looking into it because I'm very interested in martial arts, is, well, balance and stability are all very important concepts in martial arts. I started looking like proprioceptive work, people doing in terms of things of footwork, stuff like that. And it's like, well, and I see people doing stuff like single leg work, catching tennis balls, stuff like this. And I'm like, well, the problem is that those are closed balance tasks. Balance quite often is specific to whatever it is we're trying to balance specifically doing, if that makes sense. Yes, there's a general sense of balance that comes from kind of inner ear and stuff like that. But in terms of like task specific balance, often it's, contingent on whatever it is we're trying to do. So if I'm stood on one leg trying to juggle tennis balls, I'm going to get really good at standing on one leg trying to juggle tennis balls. It's not going to help me, with my backhand in tennis, my footwork on the court, or me trying to throw a jab. It's a very different skill, right? And that's where balance kind of gets a little bit of an interesting sort of look from a strength and conditioning or sports performance standpoint, is because, again, people are often trying to honor something or the notion of something, much like sports specificity, that doesn't make sense in the real world.
I'm really glad you've said that, because I give balance stuff out all the time, because for a lot of injuries, they do need to develop some level of improved balance, stability, coordination, proprioception. But because it's a skill, they often learn it relatively fast. Right, they pick it up in a matter of sometimes seconds. They're in front of you, suddenly they improve on that task. Yeah. And sure, there might be some progressions that I'll give them, but very rarely do I give someone a forever balance exercise. Mm-hmm. Maybe a single leg sit to stand as a bit of a warm-up preparation type stuff, perhaps. But I think most people, if they work hard enough and are diligent with what I ask them to do, they outgrow the need for that when it comes to performance. So I'm quite glad you said that, because I've never seen the need for someone to have a BOSU at home. I just don't think it's worth it. I think go to the gym, maybe borrow one, but you'll learn it so fast that you're no longer then getting anything out of it for a forever exercise. Yeah. And perhaps there's like, all I'm thinking, in trying to even caveat this, like what might someone be going, but is if someone has a significant structural instability and they don't want to surgically operate. As a result, they might need to keep that proprioceptive feedback a little higher than the average person, like a chronic ankle instability, chronic something else instability, knees. I can sense that the right person might need that as a ongoing exercise, but for the average person, structurally good, they're healthy in general, they just had an injury or a one-off injury, I often think they outgrow that real fast and they just need to stick to the fundamentals.
Which is why it makes even less sense for elite performers to be doing that stuff, right? Because what's the one thing elite performers are very good at? Balancing stability, proprioception, right? If anything, they're very best at that stuff. And what I found was, when I started employing this stuff, and I read Mike Boyle's book and all this stuff, I was very excited to start doing functional training and a lot of my early career. And I started getting a lot of my combat sports guys doing this stuff. And they got good at it they're like, I planned to do this for 4 weeks. They mastered it in one session, of doing whatever stability task it might be. And I was like, well, that's, again, my real world experience, my empirical experience taught me that, wait a minute, elite performers don't find this stuff challenging. If anything, it's busy work, which is the worst crime a strength and conditioning coach can commit, is just giving people busy work. And I hate that. That's something I really don't like.
and this is a phrase you said in our prep talk. It's like often physios both underload and overload at the same time, and I think that's what you're talking about there. Is the busy work is the overload, and then the 3 sets of 10, 12 is the underload. How does someone... Let's try and start to round all this together and put it into some kind of coherent message for the listener here.
Sure.
Because ultimately, there's some great stuff in here. But what are those fundamental principles? If someone is looking to put a package together for someone, they're rehabbing and they might have some specifics they're doing in rehab, but they also want to help them develop into some good quality movement patterns for sport, for life, whatever it might be. We're talking about longevity a little bit here as well.
Yeah.
How does someone create a real simple but effective plan for that person in front of them that helps to start with the reconditioning, helps to bridge that gap between injury and performance, which may or may not be about just life?
Well, I'm of the opinion it starts with you, the practitioner, and the saying I have is that you need to open the rope, pull your pants down, and have an honest look at where your competencies sit. Do you understand the basic movement patterns? Let's say the ones laid out by Dan John. Well, hopefully your listeners are familiar with Dan John, but the basic 5-6 movement patterns. Can I squat, push, pull, hinge, and load my core? What are your competencies with those movements? What's your understanding, your deeper understanding of those movement patterns? And then can you coach them? Do you understand them? Do you understand what the objective of those movement patterns are? Then you can say, well, how does my client perform those movement patterns? And we say squat, lunge count as a squat, a single leg RDL, hinge, whatever it might be, a kettlebell swing, hinge. So you go to your movement classifications. One exercise I do with my mentees is to get them to sit down, list out the 5-6 basic movement patterns, list as many exercises you can think for each movement pattern. Have an honest look at your own competency and your understanding of the umbrella of these different exercises. And then from there, once you're familiar with where you are, because it takes an honest look at yourself to say, well, this is my understanding. Now you can start to apply that to your client. Because I feel that where a lot of people perhaps don't serve their clients well is when their own shortcomings are something they're trying to hide from the client. So, if you're going to let a crap hinge slide, that's on you. And quite often, the first thing people do is they almost pull their pants down online and post videos of their clients doing stuff. And I'll look at it and go, you're supposed to be a high-level professional. Yeah, I can see, poor quality hinge, poor quality squat, pressing patterns out, pulling patterns out. And again, the relativist in them will go, well, who are you to judge? And I was like, well, I'm supposed to be an expert in my field. And it's my job to kind of judge what other people are doing in terms of movement competencies, that type of thing. Does that make sense?
But also, in the end, the economics of it is that people continue to invest in high-level coaches because they believe that it is beneficial for them. Yeah. So if people at the highest level continue to invest in coaching, there is value there.
Yeah,
there has to be. That is the economics of it. So therefore, we must continue to judge and refine and create. Firstly, as you're saying, find in yourself if you have the competencies before you start to preach it on the paying customer in front of you.
Yeah, and it's a case of also taking a good look at what your understanding of your competencies are personally. Because don't get me wrong, I have lots of friends and colleagues that are physios, but also some physios suddenly rebadge themselves as S&C coaches. And it's like, well, what's your understanding of energy systems? What's your understanding of plyometrics? What's your understanding of rate force development? These types of things. Because producing force is one thing, producing force at high levels, fully understanding eccentric, isometric, concentric effects of different loading schemes and movements. That's all stuff that matters. Again, we've got to get away from that 3x10 everything, movement done kind of lazily, that type of stuff. And it's like, well, what are my competencies? Where do I sit? How can I best serve my client in that regard? So, when you pull it together, it's a case of, well, this is where I feel confident. This is my wheelhouse. What are my adjacencies? If I don't know, can I refer out? Having a system in place for referring out if you don't understand something. And that's where I feel, particularly, go back to golf again, a lot of cases are physios not wanting to say no to a client and referring to a domain expert, and instead giving out that, spreadsheet of, or template of, here's your exercise program with some pictures, that type of stuff, because you didn't want to say no. You wanted to give them something to walk away with, and that makes a difference too. So just, again, understanding your domain expertise, what you're good at, what you're really good at, and then taking taking what we call the hard science, the structural thinking, and then also taking what's going on in your practice, the people you see in front of you, and then putting that together in a way that works for you personally. Don't be so hardcore with the structural stuff, with the science, that your programs kind of fundamentally become very cookie cutter, which is where a lot of the very structural thinking people go. They give the same program to everyone, and you've probably seen that in people's practice. Bad physios will just give the same rehab plan to everybody, right?
Absolutely, off the shelf.
Yeah. Whereas on the other hand, you've got people who are highly relativistic. They're going to be coming up with all sorts of weird and wacky exercises. Often that falls into that category we talked about earlier of busy work, time wasting, giving the client stuff to feel like they're doing something, right? And obviously, if you look in the mirror and can do that and hold your head up, then more power to you. I can't, because I feel like I'm robbing someone if that's the type of work I'm giving them.
Does it move the needle? In my head, it's always, does it move the needle enough?
Yeah.
And I think the Pareto principle comes back here, like the kind of 80-20, right? The 80 has to be that scientific, real fundamental principle stuff, like, are you getting that in? And there's some tweaks about how I dose that and how I'm going to program it for the right person and for their injury. And then that 20 is the little bit of something else, the adjunct, the some, maybe I've earned the right for the funky. I every now and again there's a little quirky thing that might go in there.
Yeah.
But the person has earned the right, and I've earned the right actually, by making sure that everything else is absolutely bang on and I'm moving the needle sufficiently to be a bit outside the box. That's how I think in the end I've shaped what I do, is that there's an element of off the shelfness of like everyone's going to get a squat hinge, a push pull, and then I start to think a bit more creatively. The artistic approach you were talking about, Picasso earlier. Yeah, I've earned the right to do that because I've spent a long time coaching this stuff as a physio, but also moving into bridging that gap and knowing how I get someone there. And I've tested and I've used numbers and I've worked with enough coaches to know that I'm using good solid base, and I've read up on this stuff because I like it and I've trained it myself. I'm interested, and I wouldn't do this in Pilates. I wouldn't do it in yoga because I haven't earned the right. I'm going to refer out. I'm going to move someone there. So some people listening, the message is get really stuck in yourself and dig deep on the research and figure out how to become the kind of bridging the gap, reconditioning type physio. But other people, it's just know when it's not your world and refer out. And both of those are the right answer. Whatever it is that works for you, whatever it is that makes sense for you is the right answer. What we're trying to get away from is that this person who just dabbles in a bit of everything because they want to hold on to it all. Yeah. And I got stuck in that when I was early in my career because I didn't have a network. I didn't have anyone I knew about to refer out to, so I just held on to it because I was worried that they'd just disappear into the ether. Yeah. So nowadays, my network's good and broad, and I've got a great team around me. If someone comes in, they want Pilates, I ain't bloody giving it. It's just not my thing. So they go to the Pilates specialist. Yeah. That's what I think you've got, right? You've got this great network around you. You know what you're good at. You know what you love coaching. So you refer out. Yeah. So this is an episode that allows the person to just be who they are, but knowing how to figure that stuff out in the end. Yeah.
Getting comfortable with, I guess, being authentic in your practice. And I think particularly going forwards, particularly with AI and stuff, rumblings we're hearing in the industry, I can already go to a ChatGPT or whatever and ask for a training program. It will give it to me, okay? However, it cannot coach me. The movements it's asking for, and eventually what we're going to see is a situation of AI programming becoming very normalized. At the moment, a lot of coaches, they roll their eyes and hate the very idea of there being that type of situation where it can just auto-generate a program. We could probably go ask, for, let's say I got an ACL tear, generate me a 12-week ACL recovery program, post-surgery, whatever, give it a few parameters and bang, it'll give me one. However, what it doesn't give me is that human experience. So those guys who sit in that, what we talked about earlier, that highly structural way of thinking, they're a little bit at risk, because we can just feed the data that these guys are generating into a system that'll spit something out that kind of works. However, what's going to change is that need for that very pragmatic, in-person, oriented approach to dealing with clients, your bedside manner, so to speak, is going to become even more important than it has ever been before. And authentic connection with the person in front of you is really going to matter, because they probably have a good idea that they could just probably ask ChatGPT for a program as well. So if they're paying you a premium, they're going to want an authentic, in-person, bespoke, and this is where I talk about craftsmanship in coaching. You're going to have to show that you understand the craft of what it is that you're doing, in terms of the way you apply exercise, in terms of the way you coach movement. That's what they're going to want, because, again, the highly structural stuff, that's going to be dealt with in the cloud. That's kind of the way I feel it's going. So that in-person experience is going to become incredibly important going forwards.
Which also highlights another pendulum that feels like it's swinging away from the online coaching.
Yes.
And there'll always be a place for it, because we've realized that it actually solves some problems. It helps some people access coaching that they weren't able to access before. But in the end, the in-person stuff will win out en masse, I believe. I really think that the value is there for people to be with other people, to experience the person, to experience the rapport, the connection. The bedside manner, as you've just mentioned, is going to become increasingly important, and that is underpinned by expert communication, expert connection, to really give the person what they need and help them to change behavior, because I think that's really what we do at our best, is we change behavior, and to do that via a screen is possible, right? I know that it's possible. I definitely find it harder, and I think the person on the other side of it is less likely to change that behavior. And the role of the in-person physio, the in-person coach, is only going to grow, I believe, and certainly the expert. I think you're right that some of the basic stuff could get hoovered up by the technologies these days, but there is a role for the ever advancing, the ever curious, potentially artistic coach, right? And I like that. I like that. I heard Brett Contreras mention that on a podcast. The way he now coaches is way more artistic. He uses scientific principles and blends it artistically to the client in front of him. That was a great episode. Listened to a year or so ago. So we are sort of wrapping up here and sort of summarizing quite nicely. I've really enjoyed the stuff here. As you can tell, I'm quite passionate about this, and happy to get into the weeds of it. What have we not spoken about today that's important? What could we finish on that you love to chat to?
Yeah, a big part, I guess, is based on my sort of experience doing this, maybe 20 years now, and the big lesson that I had to learn is that knowing, understanding, and wisdom are not necessarily the same thing. Kind of touching on what we were talking about, and that's where, again, treating what we do more like craft than it is like being a scientist. And for the longest time, everyone was the evidence-based practitioner, think like a scientist. If we just follow this very structured, structural approach to dealing with problems, and then as I've matured, as I've gotten better as a coach, definitely more craftsmanship involved in what I do, definitely trying to be wiser. I'm not perfect. I'm not the world's best coach. I'm not perfect. I make mistakes. I still make mistakes, and I'm probably going to carry on making mistakes. Try and minimize the impact of those as much as possible, because the longer I do this, I guess, the wiser I become, and the pattern recognition is an important part of that. So you've become familiar enough with enough situations over a length enough of time that you can start to, recognize the pattern of the situation and hopefully intervene early enough that you can make some sort of meaningful difference, if that makes sense. And I guess part of the issue of what I see is particularly in the modern coaching context, and this is where social media has upended everything. We have a lot of young coaches who are very media affluent, who know an awful lot, but don't understand an awful lot and aren't particularly wise, because it's very easy to make a lot of let's call them hot takes, okay? It took me a long time before I started turning around and going, actually, I don't think the Nordic is as good as it is. Again, the idea of looking out the window but not opening the door, I applied it, I toyed with it, I've watched other people have done, I've seen the situation shift, the sand shift, and turn around and gone, actually, no, I think there's something fundamentally we're missing here. But what we're seeing now, a lot of the discourse is dictated by who online? A lot of young coaches, okay, with lots of opinions, okay, and lots of
tech literate, right?
And it pushes them to make as controversial opinions as possible. Why do they do that? Because discourse and the algorithm favors controversial takes. We're wired to look towards negativity, right? So if I go out and say something, if I'm being very hostile about it, I don't think soft tissue work is any good. No one should ever do soft tissue work. It's a waste of time, and just trying to get people's backs up, trying to be an irritant, because that breaks through the algorithm, right? People are more likely to pay attention to that take. Current thing I dislike is people at the moment not being creative. What they do, and you've probably seen this, and this might well irritate you, is people criticizing other people's work. And quite often you'll get that little, portrait image of someone doing something in the background, and then someone else's head in the bottom left-hand corner going, this isn't good. This is, basically intimating that this is bad practice, or they'll then critique it. Fine, but you're not giving me anything in terms of creativity.
Or behavior change.
Yeah.
You're not going to change that person's behavior by criticizing them.
So if you're just shaking your head at someone doing some silly cupping routine, what are you offering as an alternative? Show me your creative output. Okay, that person's gone to the effort to post that video. I don't like cupping in particularly, but they've gone and put this out there. They've put in creative effort. You're then basically taking that content, criticizing it harshly, but then offering nothing of your own, and it's almost like a creative bankruptcy, let's put it that way. So it's like you're not offering any alternative, not meaningfully. All you're doing is trying to basically hoover up attention from just merely being a critic.
You're trying to humiliate someone.
Yes.
Right? And I find that real low level.
It's disturbing, right?
Like that is a real low level way of trying to improve the profession.
Yeah.
I'm not a fan of it whatsoever. I think that there's it's cheap. It's like cheap laugh stuff. It's like that. Just show that people what is good.
Yeah.
Demonstrate high level of skill in your own way, rather than humiliating another person.
And that's where you need to be, ideally, a paragon of good practice as best you can. Again, nobody's perfect, right? Nobody can put their hand on their heart and say, I'm doing the best single job every single day. You're doing the best you can, and provided you're doing the best you can, you can document that. You can put that up online for other people to see. Again, the idea is that who are you serving? Are you serving your patients, your clients, or are you serving the algorithm?
Yeah.
And I think that's where the modern coaching and modern, fitness space is where the line's been drawn. Because, and I've said this a few times, some of the best practitioners I know have barely any social media presence, if not any none, because they're busy doing the bloody job, right? They're busy actually coaching. They don't have time to put into, building a following and having a marketing strategy, and don't get me wrong, there are people who balance the two. That can be done.
It's hard though.
It's
very hard.
It's a full-time job. If marketing and social media and stuff like that, there are people who build careers solely around doing that. But obviously that comes at an expense of actually practicing your craft. That's why, if you can, document good practice, point out good practice, but just don't get caught up in this, this game of admonishing others for your own benefit. Point out what you think is good, maybe. Highlight what you think is good. But yeah, ritual humiliation is not a meaningful way forwards. And that's where, again, I think a lot of this stuff will get filtered eventually. People get a sense for it. Or what happens is people just turn off.
Yeah, I think in the end we'll look back on it as a bit of a historical moment in time of like, do you remember when we used to humiliate people as a way of trying to improve our profession? Yeah. Wow, that was dark. Yeah. That was some dark times. Like nowadays, we just celebrate good stuff. Isn't that cool? I'm hoping that we move that way. And look, what I think we've got today, like we've started with me spinning my wheels on my Brompton in one gear. We've clearly got more gears to go, right? We've figured that out. We've got ways of shifting up. We've got ways where perhaps sometimes we're shifting down in not a good way, and we're spinning wheels and having fights with people and creating this negativity around certain things. But there's gears that people can look at themselves in the mirror and figure out, how do I go up a gear here? How do I up level myself? And I think there's lots of ways people can do that based on the conversation today. It chimes very nicely with my why, my personal why, which is better never ends. And I always ask people at this point in the episode, what's your version of that? What does that mean to you? Better never ends as a concept. How would you apply that into your own way of thinking?
I guess there's a couple of aphorisms that I'm kind of known for. I guess the biggest one that I get quoted on an awful lot is eat in your own restaurant, right? And I think it originally comes from Nassim Taleb, who said something similar, and it's basically embody the virtues you espouse. If you're eating in your own restaurant, it means you like the food, right? And you trust the cook, you trust, by doing that, by embodying the virtues you espouse, you hopefully are a walking example of the virtues you're trying to embody. And that's what I mean by eating your own restaurant.
Yeah, I like that a lot. That's a really nice one. And William, where does someone go to find out a bit more about you, ask you questions, get in touch?
So Instagram's a big one. That's at Coach W Wayland, and then I'm pretty busy on Twitter as well. That's WS Wayland on Twitter. So either's good.
Mm-hmm. And I know you teach on some courses. I know you've got some good content out there that people could have a look at just to learn some of these fundamentals. What might be the best way to do that?
I've literally just launched my Hinge Mastery course literally a week ago, and that's approved. If any of you are NSCA certified, that's now been approved for 0.7 CEU, so there's that available. Hinge Mastery course is just an online course I put together to help people get really, really good at Romanian deadlifts, really get into the craft of the hinge, the history of the movement, and then how to apply it across a number of domains, including rehab through to elite athletic performance.
Yeah, and I think, look, as you were mentioning earlier, you have to look at yourself. You have to really figure this stuff out yourself. So when you go on a course like that, you'll be doing all sorts of different practical hinge, right? And you'll feel it. You'll feel what it's like. You'll get the difference between the subtleties around the pelvis, around the back extension, getting the neutral spine, getting all those things, feeling the bar in your hands. What's it like once you put a bit of load on it? So yeah, I'd be very, very supportive of people joining a course like that, because I think it's hugely valuable.
Yeah, we really, really want to dig into the craft of the movement and like how to perform it very, very well. So you walk away feeling like you could coach anybody.
Yeah. And what does the next few weeks look like for you? Are you traveling golf? How's that look?
Yeah, like? Unfortunately, the hiccup in the Middle East prevented me doing some travel recently. But I'll be in Spain next week, and then I'll be in Switzerland, and then I think I'm in Germany. So yeah, a fair bit of travel with the tour over the next few weeks.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for committing some time to us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, look forward to listening back to this one. Thanks a lot, William.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you've made it this far, that probably means you've enjoyed the show. Please leave us a review and subscribe to the show on whichever platform you use. I've been told that this stuff really does help us to reach more people like you. And if you are someone in charge of things at work, book a demo call with JNAT to see it for yourself. Use code Physio Coach 2MO to get 2 months free. To stay up to date, follow us on Instagram at Better Never Ends, or on YouTube, the Physio Coach Podcast. This podcast is a product of Better Physio Group, provider of physio and PT services in central London, helping people in pain, suffering with injury to feel better and live better. There's physio, and then there's better physio.